Welcome to Varn Vlog. And today we're going to talk about anti-politics. Now, I am not pro or anti-politics. In fact, sometimes I think the dividing line between civil society and politics proposed by a lot of anti-politicians and even by people closer to my politics like Anton Yeager and his book Hyperpolitics. I'm going to try to interview Anton, by the way. Often overstates to the seemingly very intermeshed feedback loop between political realities and social realities, as relations of production and social reproduction are often legally defined, thus tying them to the realm of politics, whether we like it or not. But that said, I do think, in light of what I talked about in an episode that I released very recently about the non-responsiveness of representative democracy in America to median voter politics, does have to be explained not just through negative partisanship that manifests itself as a counter tendency to elite consolidation. And I say a counter tendency because it's not really anti-systemic in a deep way. It doesn't actually undo those elites. It just posits a way for other elites, often less competent ones, to use their grievances to latch on to the appearance of helping the median voter while frankly fucking them even harder. Now, for this, we have to turn to the land down under and Australian anti-politics. And we're going to be talking about the piping strike a bit today, and we may or may not get to the work of Tad Teza. Now, in America, I think the most visible advocates of an anti-political understanding of political movements are the Rabble Report, and that's my friends Joseph and Grant over there. You should go check them out. And I might be doing some discussions with them sometime over the summer. I'm quite busy this summer. I'm trying to diversify my content again. But I might have them back on and talk about this in the U.S. framework. But one of the things I was looking at is a lot of the problems we see in the U.S. framework are just as pronounced in other parts of the English-speaking world and in parts of continental Europe. I would say Scandinavia, Switzerland have slightly less decayed mass politics, but these are much smaller societies in terms of population per nation state. And even they've had problems with this throughout the 21st century. So I turned to the land down under in a magazine called Minjin, which published an anonymous political writer called The Piping Strike. Now, The Piping Strike came on my radar because Grant and Joe told me to read him, but also because I started thinking about the way these trends that we often see as uniquely American, like America is uniquely unresponsive. Well, places with parliamentary democracies that have some reforms that Americans want, I mean, Australia, for example, has mandatory voting, and much better laws on voting access than the US does. It still has the same trends. And that is something you should think about. So let's go to the pipe and strike for why. I will share all the articles I talk about today in the show notes. And I want to point out that these stats that I brought up about representative are finally being understood by the public. 51% of the American public, at least according to an article shared by Matt Stoller on X, is pretty clear that politics does not represent their interest. And that's regardless of political ideology. Who they think the elites are tends to change if they're highly partisan, but that elite's control of their lives does not. So, we might talk about this as the curious death of representative democracy as being anything like representative in the English-speaking world. And we're going to use the example of Australia because that's what the Piping Strike was writing about. The author that I'm referring to argues that Australian politics is in a slow motion crisis, like most of the rest of the planet, because major political parties have lost their social foundations that they were originally built to represent, leading to an inversion of any kind of democratic principles, even representationally. And he states this in a kind of key essay called Politics Through the Looking Glass, which I think people should read. Historically, Australian politics is a representative parliamentary democracy, kind of like the United States, except the parliamentary part. We're congressional democracy, and no one quite knows what that means. Where distinct social groups form parties to represent their weight in parliament. The Labour Party was built on the social and financial weight of the massive union movement, just like the socialist parties in continental Europe were in the late 19th century. The non-Labour parties, the Liberals and the Nationals, formed to represent business and rural / petit bourgeois interest in opposition to urban unions. But the Piping Strike notes that these parties had a voting bloc clarity that is largely banished. Now, that's not entirely true in the United States. In that our two parties never formed out of a labor. We don't have a Labor Party to be degenerate. The Democratic Party, as I pointed out, was a party of planters, petit bourgeois interest, yeoman aristocrats who didn't have a formal class base in the United States, and special interest groups. The bourgeois interests were largely supported by the Republicans. In the 19th century, when bourgeois interests were, quote, more progressive, i.e., more about expanding and including more and more people into their purview, the Republicans were less reactionary. As that was no longer necessary, they became more so. But there is no Labor Party in the United States to have degenerated like this. And in fact, both the Smith Act and Taft-Hartley made sure that that really couldn't happen. But what's funny about that is maybe it wouldn't have mattered if it did, at least not in the same way, although our bourgeoisie do seem quite afraid of it. Union membership and influence has sharply declined everywhere. The sharpest is the United States, but in the English-speaking world, it's declined quite a bit, and it is declining, although not quite as precipitously, in Europe proper, which has stripped the non-Labor parties of their primary reason for opposition. So they are no longer a counter interest that represents a counter elite, because they don't have a counter to it. They don't have an elite emerging from from working class interests to oppose. So they don't have clear social bases that are supported by economic unified blocks. At least not ones that could oppose each other. And that's similar to the United States, as I talked about in the how representative democracy question that I asked in that other video. The old party frameworks do remain intact, but they adopt by rewriting the rules of democracy, thus changing the name of the game to changing the rules, not building a base. The base is largely considered irrelevant. And I think you see this even more profoundly in the United States. So the Piping Strike highlights how the concept of representation has basically flipped. In the past, a representative was put in place by a social group and was answerable to them because they had a large social base to discipline them. And I've talked about this in my many videos about DSA. You need a large social base to discipline a politician if you don't have large amounts of money. So this was the answer historically. But representation today is actually inverted, and this is particularly true in the English-speaking world, but I think it's true in general. The Piping Strike says a push for gender diversity in cabinet and within labor, regardless of what you think about its merit, was actually an attempt to change the representation of the base, not the other way around. Female MPs do not answer to specific women organizations, nor are they bound to uniforms pro-women agenda. Instead, of a social group choosing as representative to fight for them. According to the piping strike, a political class that is already in power and claims to represent them based on personal biological attributes, whether they vote in their interest or not. And I think you see this profoundly in American identity politics, where we can talk about the increase in Black representation in Congress, and that might make people feel supported and inclined. But during the same period with that increase, the material realities of Black life stagnated. They basically fell down with the Great Recession and never got back up. Now, as a white boy, I feel a little bit weird talking about this, but it's just a fact, right? That during all the periods that we saw organic anger at the police and at Black poverty and Black Lives Matter, the politics that emerged out of that was largely elite representational, not any fundamental shifts in pretty much anything. And then it led to backlash, which was absolutely predicted by people like Otto Fried. So this representation is actually more of, you see a symbolic representation and a representative, and you assume just because of that symbolic identity that they are beholden to you without any accountability whatsoever, because there's no mass base to discipline them within any groups. It's a hollow substitute for bottom-up accountability, and it's a reason why everything feels so politicized, but no one seems to have any effect on the political. Then the piping strike points out that party democracies have fundamentally changed in the 20th and 21st century. Modern political parties are shifting focus on themselves and their internal membership rather than broader social groups they used to represent. They often seek those social groups out to try to pick out who they can build a constituency out of, rather than organically coming from that constituency. The author argues that party democratization, giving party members more choice in choosing leaders, actually inflates the importance of the party as an elite sort of entity while diminishing the public's real interest. And I think that was my point separately, and talking about how, ironically, the attempts to democratize the selection of candidates and public input in the parties in the United States with the primary system reforms after the 1960s have actually made the party seemingly less responsive to public opinion, because they don't matter for how the candidates get chosen. So Shrike goes into some very Australian things here, and I'll talk a bit about them, such as the new thinkers within labor, such as Claire O'Neill and Tim Watts, who argue that political parties should act as filters for a fragmented society. When independent MPs and minor parties succeed, major party elites view this as kaleidoscope politics, which is a threat to governments rather than a legitimate reflection of voter wishes. So you still have, basically two-party dominance, both mathematically, even though you're not in as bad of a first past the post system in Australia, because the fragmentation of big blocks of party rule makes it harder to manage politics themselves, and politicians don't like that. Furthermore, even though there's a lot of attempts to save democracy, what the save democracy efforts often come down to just trying to save the administrative state, which implements and manages democracy. And that many of these political insiders, regardless of their politics, right or left, have come to view democracy itself as a management problem. And I think in progressive circles, you hear this stated outright. So another thing that has happened that the Pipe and Strike notes in Australia, which I think we can see a parallel in America, is that the media and political obsessions with the lack of the will to change reform is actually misleading. Historically, reform, and in the Australian example, the Pipe and Strike uses the Whitlam era, meant enacting changes that met the explicit needs of the electorate. Today, most journalists and commentators use reform to mean the exact opposite: tough, unpopular economic policies that politicians must have the courage to force on a resentful public for their own good, as if those politicians somehow knew more than the public itself and weren't just beholden to bourgeois powers. The author also critiques political journalists in Australia, again, like Laura Tingle, arguing that nostalgia for a golden age of unelectrical powerful bureaucracies is fundamentally anti-democratic. It values elite policy-making apparatus over the actual wishes of the public, and I think you see this contradiction in a lot of the democracy defenders and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party too. As I'm pointing out, saying that that politics, not administration, but that politics needs professionals because they know what to do, is inherently distrusting of the public. So don't be telling people that they value democracy when they think that when they think expertise is needed for even the direction of policies, not just their implementation. The piping strike says a fundamental crisis in Australian politics is institutional, and I would say that's true for the entire planet. You see similar patterns in the UK. It's profoundly similar and maybe more advanced in the US. And it's even fairly true of continental Europe, which is why you have wild oscillations and anti-systemic, not really anti-systemic, really counter-elite politics in the EU right now. The mechanism by which real-world social and economic interests naturally progress from communities to the cabinet table is fundamentally broken in Australia. It's broken in the United States. And this has led to a lot of both socialism and neopopulism as an answer, but the socialists don't have a broad enough space in government and enough money to really be able to enact changes systemically enough to make real non-reformist reforms, whatever that means. I mean, I do want to know what it means. I just don't buy that it exists. But even like it's just not possible. The donor class keeps that on check, as do all kinds of abuses of checks and balances, and that's not dealing with our court system, which progressives overly relied on in the second half of the 20th century to force change faster than the public was willing to go, even though the public was heading in the direction of the courts anyway and generally appreciated what the courts did. But this has led progressives to have an over-reliance on the administrative state, period. And I would like to think it's just liberals who've done that, but I've seen Marxists say this shit too. So the question that matters is how does society get what it actually wants? And I would say, well, capital is a block for that. And if anything, my critique of this article by the Piping Strike is it doesn't actually put all this in class terms. Although it does more so than a lot of American politics, because class blocks were how this happened, and the fragmentations of classes in society are how this really became a problem. Now, this leads me to a second essay by the Piping Strike from about 2 years later called Crack Up the Politics versus the Public, which examines the global the political instability following Brexit and Donald Trump's election in 2016. And as I said, I actually thought both of those happened rather late on the world stage. The right-wing populism was actually ascendant in parts of Asia and Latin America, particularly say like the Philippines, in the beginning of the teens, before Donald Trump came to power. It was a sign of things to come, though, as when the English-speaking world got a hold of it, of course, we do what we do and make it worse. The author, the Piping Strike, argues that the ongoing political turmoil is not a sudden rise in populism. I don't actually think so either, although populists try to use this for their own devices. And I say populist because populists aren't always all that interested in what is popularly wanted either. They just want to appear so. So again, the Strike says that this is a symptom of deeply detached political elites and an establishment based on that, which has removed any sense of responsibility from the general public. Now, again, the Strike in some ways is echoing the work of Michael Sandel, which I've talked about before, and his views of the problems of democracy and the change the meaning of democracy and community and from the 19th to the 20th to the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. If you want to read that, that's in Democracy's Discontent. But this actually goes into it probably in a way that's a little bit more clear. Now, some of this is actually going to be more removed from an American context, even though it's global. So, following the political shocks of 2016, many Anglo-American observers looked to continental Europe, such as Angela Merkel in France and Emmanuel Macron's victory. Emmanuel Merkel's uh, able to maintain power in Germany for a while. She lost it. And Emmanuel Macron's victory in France, Macron both staying in power and being immensely unpopular in France, as the bulwark of the liberal order, defending itself against, miscreants like Le Pen and Meloni in Italy. But the Piping Strike argues that Europe is not immune from instability. It's just experienced it differently than the UK, US, and Australia. By the late 2017 and 2018, traditional political orders in Europe began to unravel rapidly. Germany's major parties, the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party, collapsed to historic lows, although the Social Democratic Party was able to come to power in the 2020s and then immediately lost that power by, pissing everyone off, basically, leading to a return to Mertz's CDU now. And remember, these articles are from 10 years ago. But that basically Germany's center-right coalition has always been maintained by a fragile coalition building. Elections in Austria and Italy saw a historic decline in center-left democratic parties and a massive surge for right-wing and populist parties, including the Five Star movement and the Liga. And again, 10 years ago, this has changed now, but not dramatically. This decline of these legacy parties demonstrates the crisis is structural and widespread, moving first from Southern Europe, which was most hit by the actions of the Troika, but is now going into the prosperous North, which is also becoming less prosperous. Sound familiar? Should. The author challenges the mainstream narrative that the decline of center-left parties is disastrous for democracy. True democracy should reflect what the voters want, not prop up things that they no longer support, because those parties, regardless of what they say they support, have not passed policies that align with their rhetoric. The Piping Strike attributes this erosion to the decline of social basis of political parties, such as organized labor unions, are a specific business interests that had specific goals. And well, again, I wish you had some more political economy on here, because I do think that the decline of the business interest is both true. We even see this in the United States, but misses that capital interests are still largely represented. It's just that capital interests are bigger than most petite bourgeois concerns these days. So, lacking in organic societal checks and balances, parties have hollowed out and become susceptible to takeover by small insular cliques and special interest groups. Modern policies have thus placed representative democracy with political democracy. Instead of fighting for material interests of specific groups from the bottom up, they focus on internal branding, using ethnic or gender quotas to claim they look like an ideal cross-section of society, whether or not they pass policies that reflect that cross-section of society or not. After all, most subsections of the population are still subject to class. Even intersectionality would admit that. And thus, you're still representing elite interest, even by having those elite interests tied to the quotas of marginalized groups, as if marginalized groups don't have their own elite, both being relative terms. So the political establishment increasingly views the health of the political system itself as synonymous with democracy, rather than the execution of the general will. And this leads to the blaming, discrediting of the electorate, which is a tendency I see across the board. While the dirtbag left and the aught teens in America complained about this, they often get mad about this in terms of the DSA or other groups calling their candidates out for not being able to deliver on their promises. Thus, they complain about Democrats blaming their voter base, but then they get mad at their own progressive and socialist voter base when their voter base doesn't go with their will either. And while they say they're representing general political interest against, uppity ultras or whatever, Often what they're doing is just trying to establish a counter elite, and they don't want criticism in doing it because neither side has actually enacted the policies that they're said have been voted in office to do. Sometimes because they don't want to, and sometimes because they can't, but that hardly matters to the general public when you said you could. So consequently, this leads to a disconnect over the meaning of democracy itself, as I've talked about in my discussion of a piece by Adam Spersowski, the former analytic Marxist, about the quote-unquote crisis of democracy being more a crisis of dissatisfaction of fragmented representation, not an actual crisis of democracy. Although we are in an increasingly less democratic country, and to be quite frank, democratic responsiveness in our system has always been extremely low anyway, particularly in the United States, but in the English-speaking world in general. It's just gotten a lot worse since the 1980s. The Pipe and Strike points out that the hypocrisy in this is obvious. Observers will argue that voters are reacting out of racism or xenophobia regarding things like immigration, even in regions where actual immigration rates are exceptionally low, ignoring voters' deep economic and political alienation from the establishment. It may be incorrect who the voters are blaming, but you're going to have to convince them of that if you care about democracy. And if you don't care about democracy, then quit saying you do. So the take back control slogan ironically had power back to the Westminster parliamentary class when 3/4 of the MPs originally opposed leaving the EU. Figures within the British establishment then attempt to use the concept of parliamentary sovereignty as a tool to delay, dilute, or completely overturn the largest democratic mandate in British history. Whether you like it or not, and whether you think it is reactionary or not, and I do think Brexit has ultimately been both self-destructive and reactionary, the issue is it was wanted by the general public for reasons of the political class's actions. And while the general public has not benefited from this democratic input, ultimately, it's also not clear that they were benefiting from the EU. And I say this because this is something that you have to deal with if you're going to be democratic at all. Instead of calling the public stupid or not are having trouble dealing with the mandate, you have to ask yourself, how did we fail to get people to understand what was at stake? And to be quite honest, in the case of Brexit, both staying in the EU and leaving the EU is probably bad for the average Briton. Either one of them are going to be bad for them. So another thing that the Pipe and Strike points out is the assumption that the public is reactionary by a lot of the political class is actually wrong. So the Pipe and Strike references intense political resistance to holding a public plebiscite on same-sex marriage. Progressive social movements and politicians fought against the public vote, calling it a glorified opinion poll and expression of fear of the tyranny of the majority. But the Pipe and Strike noted that the public overwhelmingly voted for same-sex marriage anyway, showing that political class and activist groups came to view the public as an unpredictable adversary rather than a partner in democracy, when the public even shared their fucking opinion. I think we see similar things in the US. While there are things in which the public can be made reactionary on, we tend to find that in the beginning, before things are politicized, that generally the general public is in favor of expanding rights. Since they understand that expanding rights also means they get them. And they don't want people telling them what to do. And this is in 2016, before the tech oligarchs and everything have made everything infinitely worse. Now, I'm going to come back to these two essays and add another one by Tad Taza on this in our next episode on antipolitics, and then talk about how Marxists should respond to this. I do not think this is a perfect framework for Marxists, but I do think we have to admit that there's a ton of truths in this about what has happened to parliamentary representative democracy and congressional representative democracy, and why they are effectively less and less democratic. What should a socialist do about this? That's a different question, and one beyond the purview of the piping strikes concerns. The piping strikes concerns is the fear of democracy coming from the advocates of democracy. And in the United States, I think this is manifested both in the conservative insistence that we're a republic, not a democracy, although they don't seem to know what either one of those two terms actually means. And a increasing use of the courts, which was a progressive old gambit to limit expansions of political power that are popularly democratic. The other thing is an over-reliance on the executive, which is not the proper organ of democracy. The executive oversees the functioning of the government, and is, somewhat indirectly democratically elected in the United States, although it's not quite the same as like the way prime ministers and heads of government work in parliamentary systems. But nonetheless, it's important to remember that that's become the primary locus of most politics, and it's one where an individual actor has the least systemic reasons to stay faithful to their voter base, particularly during their second term. This is a known problem in the United States where we have term limits and where there's a lot of executive privilege that already exists and is always being expanded. So the piping strike's fundamental dilemma is one Marxists should take seriously. The political establishment was structured in a way that's lost a connection to broader society because the political economic relations in broader society have changed. Now, the piping strike doesn't put it that way, but that is what they are describing. I don't know their gender. And in trying to protect himself from political disruption, it has come to view the public's actual democratic choices as a threat, passing more and more anti-democratic measures and relying more and more on administrative fiat. But then when their enemies come into power, their enemies have less and less public responsiveness too, and also have a system that is less and less tied to any political base, which means that even in opposing these populist demagogues, they can't do anything. By the system they created to protect themselves from the public, and as those demagogues divorce themselves from from public opinion, which they inevitably do because they have power and they don't need the public anymore, this seems to set up a spiral. By positioning parliament and political parties as bulwarks against the population, a political class is managing for elites that are treating democracy itself as the problem, while also claiming to save democracy from demagogues who are using the very anti-democratic systems that they set up. Once you realize that, you realize what the task is for socialist reform in the United States. It's a lot harder than it initially looks, and is not just about voting people in the office. And in fact, voting people into office on anti-political mandates and then having them, not be able to deliver the politics and also not stay sufficiently distanced from politics, from political classes, often means that the popularity waves that brought them into power against other established politicians turns against them. And if people trying to, use democracy to get massive social reforms in America don't realize this, they're going to consistently hit a wall where they look hostile to the public they're claiming they represent. Now, I could talk about this specifically in the problems that are happening in New York with Zoran Mamdani, but I am going to let you figure that out. Plus, I don't want to come off as anti-Zoran, not because I am pro or anti-Zoran, although I think Zoran's probably a better politician than I thought initially, given the way he came to power. I also think that he's running into some severe problems that are going to come from economic austerity and structural limits that the socialists who voted him in office did not fix before they put him in power. But such is a problem with focusing on the executive. Anyway, I'll come back to another article on antipolitics, and then we'll do some analysis tied to all three in the next episode. Protect your peace.